And now we turn to Daf Ayin Tes Amid Beis. And we're going to be medayik in the language of the Mishnah and Sukkah. The Mishnah says that the machal that he ate was less than a kibetza. And that's the story and the sefer of the Mishnah of Rabbi Tzadok, of Ochel Pachos Mi Kibetza Chutz L'Sukkah. Ha kibetza. The implication would be that if the machal was a shear of kibetza, by sukkah, he would require a sukkah. Now, if that be the case, isal kedaitach, if you claim, as we saw in Rabbi Yehuda on Amud Aleph, that a koseves hagasa sha'amru with regard to Yom Kippur is seira mikabetza, it's greater than the volume of a kibetza, then let's go back to the reisha of the Mishnah in Sukkah, in the case of Rabbi Yochanan and Rabbi Gamliel, and they brought in front of them shtei kosovos, hashta shtei kosovos. And let's assume even if the shtei kosovos are below garin, they are without the pit. Let's just assume so. And lo havi kibetza. Obviously, if they said that according to the strict letter of the law, we don't have to eat this food of shtei kosovos in the sukkah, then obviously, according to any logic that we would suggest, it's got to be less than a kibetza. If it was a kibetza, then certainly they would have had to eat it in the sukkah mikra adin according to the strict letter of the law. So we're telling you now that shtei kosovos without the pits are less than a kibetza. It's koseves agasa v'garinosa mi avi yisera mi kibetza. Is it possible that Rabbi Yehuda is right that if you have one single koseves agasa and you add the pit, that is larger than a kibetza? How can it be larger than a kibetza? We're saying that two kosovos without a garin in each one of them is less than a kibetza. And the Gemara is assuming beyond question that the basar of the tamra is larger than the pit. And the Gemara answers, Rabbi Yirmiyah, in that which you rejected is actually true. Shtei kosovos below garinosam lo avi kibetza, and koseves agasa v'garinosa havi yisera mi kibetza. Meaning that Rabbi Yirmiyah is claiming that the size, the volume of the pit is greater. It exceeds that of the volume of the tamra without the pit. And therefore, shtei kosovos without the pits equals X, and that's less than a kibetza. But one koseves with its pit, that pit is larger than the second koseves, and therefore one koseves agasa with its garin is larger than two kosovos without a pit, and therefore it's greater than a kibetza. It's larger than a kibetza, and that's how we defend Rabbi Yehuda. And the Gemara is going to make one attempt now in the name of Rav Papa to defend the answer of Rabbi Yirmiyah. Rav Papa, Hainu Diamri Inshi, that's why people use a certain phrase, a certain idiomatic vernacular. They say tre kabe de tamre, two kavim, which is a certain volume of tamri are dates with their pits, has chad kava de kashiasa usariach. It's the equivalent of one kav of pits, usariach, and a little bit more. So you see clearly that Rabbi Yirmiyah is right. The garin of the tamar is even larger than the basar, than the tamar itself. However, now the Gemara wants to take a different approach to defend Rabbi Yehuda. Rava Amar, you know what? Maybe the Makshan who raised this question is correct. And a koseves agasa with its pit inside is larger than a kibetza. And shtei kosovos is less than a kibetza. Hasam, there in the Mishnah, when it says shtei kosovos of Rabbi Gamliel, that according to the strict letter of the law, they could eat it, they were allowed to eat it outside the sukkah, even though a kibetza is chayav in sukkah. So we're holding now that shtei kosovos is larger than a kosevis with its garin, and both are larger than a kibetza. And for deswegen, he's potter from sukkah. Why? Hainu taima mishum David peri, who peri lo boy sukkah. Whenever you eat fruits, no matter what volume of fruits you eat, it's always considered achilas arai. You cannot set up an achilas keva on peros. Now the Gemara objects to Rava from a brisa. Amar Rebbe kishayinu lomdim Torah eitzel Rebbe Loza ben Shavua. Haviu lefanenu te'edim v'anav. And it was Sukkos, and they brought us figs and grapes. V'achalnum achilas haroy chutz sukkah. We ate it in the house because it was considered an achilas haroy. Why was it an achilas haroy? We ate a small volume of te'enim and anovim, and we were surely eating less than the share of an achilas keva. Therefore, we were allowed to eat it outside the sukkah. And the Gemara is now medayik from the language of the Brisa. Achilas haroy in. They were allowed to eat these figs and dates in a very small volume as an achilas haroy. But achilas keva, had they eaten a shear of kibetza, low. And here we see that even fruits, in this case figs and grapes, lend themselves to a chiyuv sukkah if you're kovea an achilas keva. How do we reconcile this with Rav, who says that fruits, no matter what size, what volume, it's always considered an achilas haroy? Ema. So the Gemara now reinterprets the brisa and the intention and the meaning of Rebbe. Achalnum, we ate these figs and grapes even in large volume. Ke achilas haroy. It has the status of achilas haroy. You just add one letter to the brisa, the chaf hadimyon, and we ate it chutz l'sukkah. And Rebbe wants to tell us with this testimony that we ate peros in great volume, and it always had the status of achilas haroy. Hence, we defend Rava's premise that there's no such thing as an achilas keva and a chiyuv sukkah on peros. Ibois ema. The Gemara offers another answer, and it means that we can include in the words of Rebbe achilas pas, and this is what Rebbe was saying. Achalnum, we ate the fruits, achilas keva, with a very large volume, but ve'achalnu pas, and in addition, we ate a piece of bread which was less than a kibetza, and that's called achilas haroy, be'hadayu, together with the peros, chutz l'sukkah. It still had the status of achilas haroy, and it means that even though the peros themselves would have been the shear of an achilas keva, but peros by definition are classified and defined as achilas haroy, and since the pas that we ate together with the peros was less than a kibetza, therefore it was an achilas haroy, and we were potter from sukkah. The Gemara now brings a proof from a brisa to support the din of Rava that achilas haperos is not chayav in sukkah. We're going to quote a Mishnah in Sukkah on Daf Chav Zayin. The Mishnah presents the Shita Rabbi Eliezer that during the course of the 7 days of Chag HaSukkos we must eat a minimum of 14 seudos twice daily, once during the daytime hours and once during the nighttime hours. And that's for all 7 days, 2 meals a day. 2 times 7 is 14. The Chachamim reject Rabbi Eliezer, and according to their opinion, there's no chiyuv suda except for the first night of Yontif, but the other 14 sudas, the balance of the 14 sudas that Rabbi Eliezer says Yechayav, no, there's no obligation to eat those sudas. Now the Brisa says the following, according to Rabbi Eliezer. Lefichach, im hishlim b'minei targima yotza. He doesn't have to eat all 14 seudos to fulfill his chiyuv from pas. He can eat some of the seudos with minei targima. And minei targima are kind of like cakes and cookies and the like that is served as a dessert. And that too, also you could have other kinds of minei targima. Rashi holds that basar v'dagim Anything that comes as a side dish together with pas is also classified as mini targima. And all these can be used to make up the 14 sudos that you're required to eat. And therefore, Yatza, he has fulfilled one of his sudos at least from the 14, even though he didn't eat bread and he only ate mini the targuma. Says the Gemara, Isa conducted Periboy Sukkah, if you're going to reject Rava and maintain that if you kovea and eat a serious volume of peros, then you're chayv in Sukkah is listening. Why does it say that Rabbi Eliezer in this brisa can be allow you to mashlim a mini targuma peros? It should have mentioned fruits to teach us that fruits likewise are considered a suda, part of the mitzvah of Teshru of Sukkot, and they can make up to 14. So Gemara gives a number of answers to reject this proof. My meaning targima peros. The word targima is a generic word that includes fruits. So fruits is also included in a chiyuv sukkah if you are kovea and you ate enough fruits. Alternatively, we can interpret that brisa as referring to a location where they simply didn't have fruits. Here we are in Eretz Yisrael. We don't appreciate all the fruits that we have. It wasn't a given that there were fruits in any place. So if there were no ein peros mitzuyim, then the Mishnah and the brisa mentioned mini to targima, omitting peros, because it was more common in those areas to be mashlim the 14 sudas with mini to targima and not with peros. Now, until this point in the Gemara, we've been dealing with the shita of Rabbi Yehuda, and he's of the opinion that kol seves agasa is greater than a kibetza. At this point, the Gemara is going to quote the dissenting view of Rav Zvid. Rav Zvid rejects Rabbi Yehuda, and he holds that kol seves agasa is less than a kibetza. Rav Zvid Omar kol seves agasa sha'omru. Amru means that in our Mishnah they told us that if you eat the shir of kol seves agasa on Yom Kippur, you're chayav chasera mi kibetza. It is less than a kibetza, and here Rav Zvid rejects the shita Rabbi Yehuda, who identifies kol seves agasa as greater, as larger than a kibetza. This nan, Rav Zvid now proves his shita from a Mishnah at the beginning of Masechet Beitza with regard to the Iser Bal Yirah Bal Yimotze in Chametz and on Pesach. Now, by way of introduction, let's talk about two categories of food that generate a violation of Bal Yirah Bal Yimotze if you own them during Pesach. One is called Chametz, which is leavened bread, and the other is called Si'ar. Si'ar, which is called leaven, it's some identified as yeast. That's a bread that leavened for a very long period of time, such that it becomes a chemical substance that speeds up the process of fermentation of leavening, so that chametz is not able to be machametz another dough if you add chametz, but once it becomes beyond chametz si'ar, then si'ar is a leavening agent, and the Torah mentions with regard in the context of Bal Yirah Bal Yimotze both chametz and si'ar. And as we're going to see, Beit Shammai were very confused about the fact that the Torah had to mention both chametz and si'ar in the context of Bal Yirah Bal Yimotze. After all, si'ar is what we call chimutzo kosher, and it certainly is chametz. It's a lot worse than chametz. So once you mention chametz, then for sure you violate Bal Yirah Bal Yimotze by possessing si'ar. And therefore, Beit Shammai is going to come to the conclusion that from the fact that the Torah explicitly mentions both si'ar and chametz, it must have some fundamental difference between them. Beit Shammai omrim si'ar b'kezayis. In other words, CR, which is used as a leavening agent, that's called in Lashon Kodesh Machametz Es HaIsa, and CR is described as Chimutzo Kosher. It has the classic shear with regard to Bal Yorah B'Yimotzei of Isuri Achil of Kol Tarkula, namely a Kizais. But Chametz has a shear of Kikoseves. And the shear of Koseves as a Kula in Chametz, because again, Chametz is lower on the echelon, on the totem pole. It's not Chimutzo Kosher. Is a shear that's greater than Kizayis, so that if you only have a Kizayis of CR, you violate Bal Yorah B'Yimotzei. If you only have a Kizayis of Chametz, you do not violate Bal Yorah B'Yimotzei, because you need a shear that's greater than a Kizayis, and that is Kikoseves. Beis Hillel disagree, and they hold that both CR and Chametz have the same identical shear of a Kizayis. Vavinen ba, and we have a give and take in analyzing Beit Shammai. My time at Beit Shammai, why doesn't he agree with Beis Hillel? And we should identify a uniform shear for both Chametz and CR. And the answer is because Beit Shammai were asking the following question: Nichtov Rachmana. The Torah could have said, this is a pasuk in Shmos Yud Gimel pasuk Zayin, Lo Yirah Lecha Chametz, V'lo Bai, and it doesn't need to say Lo Yirah Lecha CR. And the pasuk Lo Yirah Lecha CR now becomes redundant. Why? Ano Aminin Kal V'chomer. I'll apply the logic of a Kal V'chomer. Ma Chametz she'ein Chimutza Kosher. Chametz on the totem pole vis-a-vis CR is lower, and yet also Kizayis, because again we're assuming that the shear of Kol Yisurei Torah is Kizayis, and even Bal Yorah B'Yimotzei has the shear of Kizayis. And in addition, we have in the mitzvah of Bir Chametz an equation between the mitzvah of Bir Chametz and the Itzur Bal Yorah B'Yimotzei, and the Torah is telling me destroy that amount of Chametz, that if you were to come Chas V'Shalom to eat it on Pesach, you'd be chayiv kares for that. Is CR shechimutzo kosher? If we compare CR to Chametz, CR is more chametzdik than Chametz. Is lo kolshkein, certainly it should be asur b'chametz. Why did the Torah then feel compelled to write lo yirah lecha CR? Elami demhalginan rachmana, since Rabbanan made a distinct, the Torah made a distinction between Chametz and CR. Limdechallah, it's coming to teach us sheshiyuro shel zeh lo keshiyuro shel zeh, that Chametz and CR have two different shiurim, and therefore CR b'kizayis for Chametz b'koseves, and that justifies why the Torah felt it necessary to write both of them. If the Torah had only written Chametz and we derived Sar from Kal V'chomer, we would apply the principle in Kal V'chomer of Dayo Levam and Adin Lios Kidnada, and CR would have the same shear as Chametz. Therefore, the Torah wrote CR to tell me that CR has a different shear than Chametz, and CR is more Chomer than Chametz. CR is going to have the uniform and universal shear of a Kizayis, whereas Chametz is Lekula, it's more lenient, it's not as severe of a chimutz as CR. It cannot be Machametz Isos Acheros, and therefore you need a larger shear, something that's greater than a Kizayis, and that's called a Koseves. Now the Gemara wants to bring a raya to the Shita of Rav Zvid, who holds that a Koseves is less than a Kibetza. If you will maintain the Shita of Rabbi Yehuda, that Koseves Agasa Shomru, that in regard to have Mishnah Yom Kippur, Koseves Agasa Yisera Mi Kibetza, it's larger than a Kibetza. And now Beit Shammai wants to tell us that Chametz has a larger shear, which is Lekula, than CR is Mithlei Beit Shammai. With regard to the Isur Bal Yorah and Chametz, Ashiyura de Nafish Mikazais Kamahadri. He's looking for a shear that's larger than a Kizayis. If CR is also a Kizayis, then Chametz has a larger minimum shear. And therefore, lisne kibetza. Why didn't he mention kibetza with regard to the shear of chametz? That the shear of chametz should be kibetza. If the shear of siyar is kizayis, the shear of chametz is larger than a kizayis, and that's a kula, and that's going to be the shear of kibetza. The inamiki adodininu, even if you'll argue that kosevis is not larger than a kibetza, but rather the same size as a kibetza, I would still ask the question, nisne kibetza, because the shear in Kol HaTorah Kula, in the language of the Mishnah, is a kibetza. We never find in the language of the Mishnah kosevis. So if you want to jack up the shear beyond the kizayas, mention a kibetza. And according to your Shita Rabbi Yehuda, who hold that kosevis agasa is larger than a kibetza, then when we go up one level from kizayas, we should go up to the level of kibetza. Elolav shmamino kosevis pchutza mi kibetza. That kosevis is a smaller shear than kibetza. And when Beit Shammai wanted to be makil in the case of chametz, he gave the shear of kosevis. He wasn't going to go that far beyond kizayas to be makil and require a shear of kibetza. And the Gemara now rejects this proof. Mimai. How do you know to prove from here that a kosevis agasa is smaller, is less of a volume than a kibetza? Dilma Liola name Luchai will tell you that kosevis agasa sha'amru yesera mi kibetza. That as far as the shear of kosevis agasa with regard to Yom Achil and Yom Kippurim, that is greater than a kibetza. And now we could support Rabbi Yehuda's premise. But stama, a kosevis stama, has the shear of kibetza, and that's what Beit Shammai meant when he spoke about chametz. He didn't mention the word hagasa as we thought initially, but rather he just mentioned the word kosevis. And a kosevis, an average date, without its gasa, not being a large one, is equivalent to a kibetza. Or inami ki adodininu, it's possible that the shear of kosevis agasa is equal to that of a kibetza. And when the Mishnah says kibetza, it means that kosevis agasa is like a kibetza. And we're not talking about a kosevis abeidus. And now you're asking me, why did the Tana mention kosevis and not beitza? There were two possible ways of giving a name for the shiurim, and it was a choice. It was a toss-up. And the Tana decided to use the phrase kosevis agas. But you cannot prove from this Tana, from this Mishnah, that kosevis agas is less than a kibetza. Ela mihacha says Rav Zvid, I have another proof from a Mishnah in Masechet Brachos on Daf Mem Hey. Ad kama, what's the shear of achila? For zimun mizamnin olav, which means that we bench, and if we have three people together, we'll bench as a group of three, is ad kizayis divrei Rabbi Meir. You must eat at least a kizayis worth. Once you ate a kizayis of pas, then the zimun and birkas hamazon. Rabbi Yehuda omer ad kibetza. It's not enough to eat a kizayis to be chayiv in birkas hamazon. This we saw in Rabbi Tzadok before. But rather you have to eat a kibetza. B'maikol miflagi. What is the Yisoda Plukta? What are they arguing about? The pasuk says, "V'achalta v'savatu beirachtas Hashem Elokecha," and this is the source for the chiyuv birkas hamazon in Torah. And here's the machlokas. Rabbi Meir savar v'achalta, that the machayev of birkas hamazon is achila, zu achila, and when it says v'savata, it means shtia. And when are you considered to have eaten an achila which meets up to the standards and the requirements of achila of Kol HaTorah Kula? Achila b'kezayis. Kezayis is enough of a shear, and v'achalta v'savata achila and shasiya v'kezayis is ubirachta yechayv birkas hamazon. Rabbi Yehuda savar v'achalta v'savata. The word v'savata is not a reference to beverages, to liquids, but rather it qualifies the word v'achalta. And it means achila sheyesh bo svia. You have a sense of being satiated. And it's not enough to eat a kizayis to get that sense of being satiated. The ezeh, what is a shear of achila? That is an achila sheyesh bo svia kibetza. So now the Gemara wants to prove the shita of Rav Zvid. If you're going to argue, as Rabbi Yehuda argued, that koseves agasa shamru in Yom Kippur yisera mikabetza, it's larger than a kibetza. Is hashta kibetza sibui misaba? Rabbi Yehuda's point here in the Mishnah in Brachos was that if you eat a kibetza pas, it brings you to a state of satiation. Is daite lo miyasva? The Gemara asks as a rhetorical question, it's not going to reach yishuv adas, which is the opposite of inui. And if it's antithetical to inui because it's yishuv adas, then certainly he would be chayav on Yom Kippurim. So how can you claim, Rav Yehuda, that the shear that's required, the minimum amount to violate achila and chayav kares for Inu and Yom Kippurim is more than a kibetza seves agasa? If kibetza is enough to satiate you, should certainly have reached the state of yishuv dati. You should be chayav for a kibetza. Why do you have to be chayav only if you eat more than a kibetza, namely kol seves agasa? El lav shmamina, but rather we can prove conclusively that kol seves agasa sha'amru, with regard to the shir of achil of Yom Kippurim, pachos mi kibetza, it's less than a kibetza. And therefore, kibetza misaba, but koseves is miashva daita. Now we have three definitions of achila. We have the basic definition of a maisa achila, which is kizayis. Then we go up one level, and we get to koseves hagasa, and that, which is less than a kibetza, but it's more than a kizayis, that already achieves the state of being of yishuv adas, and that's mafkia. It undermines his state as ma'una, and he's chayav on Yom Kippur. And then the highest level is called svia, and that's the requirement for Birkas Hamazon, which is the shear of kibetz. Now the Gemara is going to bring a brisa that discusses all the shiurim with regard to achila, and to understand the difference between the shear of achila and Yom Kippurim to other shiurim of achila, and that's the brisa of Rebbe Tanya Rebbe Omer. And this is the Gemara on Daf Pei. Kol hashiurim kulam b'kizayis chutz mitumas ochlin sheshina hakosav v'machma'an, and therefore shinu chachamim b'shiurim v'rayel l'dover Yom Kippur. So tomorrow, Mirza Hashem will compare the shear of tumas ochlin, how much of an ochel is susceptible to being contaminated under the law of tumas ochlin, and how much is the shear of a violation of achila on Yom Kippurim, and why the equation and the analogy between the two. Okay, then, wishing you a very wonderful day.